Well, moving on to another angle of this war, then, Arab nations were quick to reject Donald Trump's plan for the U.S. to take control of Gaza and resettle its residents on their territories. But actions, of course, speak louder than words. So the next question is, how exactly will they counter it? That's going to be the focus of that meeting between leaders from the Gulf nations alongside Egypt and Jordan this Friday. A source close to the Saudi government has said that they will be discussing a reconstruction plan for Gaza, indeed aimed at countering Donald Trump's. So for more, Hussein Ibish joins us on the program. He's a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Thank you very much for joining us, sir. To start, there have been rumors that this meeting could involve discussions on the so-called Egyptian plan, composed of 3 technical phases over a period of up to 5 years. What do we know about this plan, and do you think that it's something that, if pursued, could satisfy both the United States and Israel?
Well, it's not going to satisfy Israel at all. Okay, what we know about the plan is that it's a basic logical structure for reconstruction in Gaza, creating an alternative civil administration which is not Hamas, but derives its power either formally or informally from the PLO and the PA in Ramallah. In other words, from the secular nationalist Palestinians. The problem is the Israelis fear and hate the PLO and the PA more than they fear and hate Hamas, despite October 7th, because they know Hamas is radioactive and incapable of creating a state, and it isn't even their agenda to create a state. The biggest Israeli fear is the situation getting out of their control and a Palestinian state being created despite their best efforts. So they are almost certainly going to reject any reconstruction plan. And one final thing, the claims by the Trump administration that all of this discussion about reconstruction is shaken up by Donald Trump's brilliant ideas about Gaza is nonsense. People have been talking about exactly this kind of thing since at least November of 2023. And now they're talking about it in a more serious way because of Trump, but it's not anything more realistic as long as Israel says no. And Israel is going to keep on saying no into the foreseeable future.
Hussein, to your first point, now I asked this question to a guest actually about Ukraine yesterday. I think the parallel being that both crises seem to be at such a standstill with no realistic plan that would satisfy the parties concerned. So I'm going to ask you the same thing about the war in Gaza. What type of peace plan do you see as possible that both sides, including and also the United States, would deem acceptable?
None. Simple as that. None. Prime Minister Netanyahu is not going to agree to a peace plan because, look, there are 3 entities that could control Gaza effectively. One is the Israeli military, the second is Hamas, and the third is an alternative Palestinian civil administration, which ultimately would be connected to the PA and the PLO in Ramallah, the group that the Israeli right wing fears the most. Okay, so the Israeli military is not going to be willing to rule in Gaza into the indefinite future. They're already bleeding people with the limited presence they have. Okay, the Israelis are not going to accept an alternative Palestinian administration that strengthens the hands of the Palestinians who could create a state in the West Bank. What they're going to do is exactly what they're doing now, allowing the return of Hamas to power. It is a strategic decision on the part of Israel to let Hamas come back to power. But that's not a peace plan because they're never going to formally accept that. They're just going to insist that that's what happens. And because of that, I think we have an open-ended, on-again, off-again war into the foreseeable future where the Israelis act whenever they want to act, and they leave the whole place in squalor and misery. Hamas continues to crawl out of the rubble and wave the flags that we're looking at now on your screen. And, that's exactly what's going to happen. So a peace plan, no. The return of Hamas rule, yes, because that is Israel's strategic choice.
So if we take Israel out of the equation just for now, we know that Arab states, by and large, reject Donald Trump's Gaza resettlement plan. But there are also disagreements among Arab states as well about what an alternative would or should look like. What are some of the sticking points, if you agree that there are sticking points, then, between regional actors?
Well, not really, no. I mean, so the 6 Gulf countries that are meeting today have different ways of saying no, right? They have different, they say no in different language, right? So the Saudis say no in a nice way. The Emiratis say no in an extremely nice way. The Qataris and the Kuwaitis say no in a more vociferous way. Then when you bring in the Egyptians and the Jordanians, they're saying no, and by the way, hell no. Although the Jordanians did say they'll take people who need urgent medical care, which they're going to send on to Europe anyway, because they don't have, you know, the sophisticated facilities for people who are badly injured and need, you know, major reconstructive surgery and things like that. So it's all for show. Look, there is nowhere for these Palestinians to go. Trump's plan is a lysergic LSD-based fantasy. It is an absolute hallucination, all right? The Egyptian policy of not letting people be transferred from Gaza into Egypt goes back to the early 1950s. They're not changing that policy. There's no way to get these people to Jordan except through some kind of death march, a trail of tears through the Negev desert. That's not going to happen. So all of this is so much balderdash. I think what lies behind it is the potential for a new American policy welcoming Israeli annexation in the West Bank. And Trump said he'd have an announcement on that in the coming weeks. And I wouldn't be surprised if all this does is tee up a whole new way of discussing Palestinians that dismisses them and their rights, their connection to their land, and their national and collective legitimacy, so that the U.S. can smile on Israel doing what Trump proposed in January 2020, which is annexing another 30–40% of the West Bank, and finally nixing a Palestinian state altogether.
I mean, you say that they all have different ways of saying more or less forcefully no to his plan, but I think the first thing that comes to mind when you say that is that Donald Trump also has a very forceful way of pursuing what it is that he wants. He may not be the first, but he certainly has things to hold over many of these countries' head, aid being one of them, especially for places like Egypt and Jordan. So is it realistic then to expect a plan that does anything other than cave to some of Donald Trump's at least priorities?
Yes, I think it is realistic to expect that. I don't think the Egyptians care at all about the $1.3 billion in 1979 dollars that is military aid that is given to the Egyptians and turned and funneled right back to American companies for military goods and services. I don't think they care a damn if that gets cut off. The Jordanians, it's a more delicate thing. But again, I think cutting off the Jordanians isn't plausible. And besides, there is no way to get those people to Jordan. So it's just so much hot air. The Gulf countries get no aid from the United States. They pay money to the United States. They buy stuff from the U.S., so they're immune from that kind of pressure.
But do you think they would use leverage in that sense? Because, I mean, I agree. Of course, they certainly have things to take away from the United States. But are they in a place where they're willing to do that?
No. They're only willing to say no. And they can say no forcefully, some of them nicely, some of them more bluntly. But no, I mean, they're not going to pressure the United States. They're not going to say, we're not going to buy, you know, F-35s or F-22s or F-16s or whatever it might be, expensive stuff that we want, just because we're mad at you for saying something ridiculous about Gaza. No. They're not going to do that. What they are going to do is feel forced to create an alternative plan that maybe puts pressure on Netanyahu, not on Trump. Because Trump, I think, might welcome this reconstruction plan. If the Arabs say, we'll come in, we'll pay for it, we'll provide even some troops for post-conflict stabilization, which the UAE has said it would, that's something the U.S. would really like. But that puts Netanyahu in a real bind, because to do that, you'd need to create an alternative Palestinian civil administration, which again would strengthen the hands of the PLO and those Palestinians who want to talk to Israel and do a deal with Israel, rather than those who want Palestinians who want to kill Israelis. And this Israeli government ultimately prefers the Palestinians who want to kill Israelis to Palestinians who want to talk to Israelis because of their fear of a Palestinian state.
So speaking of a Palestinian state, then, to conclude, earlier this month, Saudi Arabia restated and affirmed its long-held position on supporting the establishment of a Palestinian state. at this point are any, I mean, you mentioned some possibilities there in that prior response. What would that mean for the possibility of moving towards that objective?
No, well, if Trump forced the Israelis to accept an alternative Palestinian administration that was informally linked to Ramallah, it would strengthen that plan. But I think Trump is preparing to bless Israeli annexation in the West Bank as he proposed in January 2020, which would encompass the Jordan Valley, which would leave the Palestinian entity or Palestinian areas in the West Bank entirely encircled by a greater Israel, like Lesotho is encircled by South Africa. And that would annoy Israelis because it would be a kind of little Palestinian statelet where at least they couldn't put settlers. But it wouldn't please Palestinians at all because they want a real state, and it wouldn't be a real state. But Trump could call that statehood, and that might just be enough for Saudi Arabia, especially if it's all left very vague for the meanwhile, to accept that Israel has recognized the Palestinian right to a state and then go ahead with normalization. I think that's Trump's hope. I think it's a vain hope. I don't think it's likely to happen. It's a very long shot, but that's where we're going. I think we're headed towards a status quo in Gaza with Hamas in control and constant low-level warfare and annexation in the West Bank. I think that's where things seem to be headed.
Certainly seems that the last thing that we're headed towards is peace, unfortunately, for the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands that are suffering in the meantime. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, Hussein Ibish. Right. But thank you so very much for coming on the show today.
Oh, you nailed it. Thank you very much.